This clip will examine the anatomy of a neuron, but before we dive into the structure of a neuron, let's go ahead and talk about what a neuron is and what it does for the nervous system. So a neuron is the cell of the nervous system that is going to perform the communication role. And so neurons form networks and they communicate. So let's talk about how this happens. 1. The first characteristic of a neuron is excitability. What this means is that it's able to sense different stimuli from the internal and external environment of your body. And so they exhibit this characteristic to the highest degree. Now, after being excited, what are they able to do? Well, the second characteristic is conductivity. And so neurons can conduct electricity, and this electricity or electrical impulse is called the action potential, and we're going to be looking at that in more detail in another video. But so they communicate by conducting electricity, and then finally, the way that they relay this electricity or electrical impulses or messages to other neurons is by secretion. And so at the very end or the tips of the neuron, we have what we call axon terminals, and they secrete chemical messengers as a way to communicate with the neighboring neurons. So we'll be talking about that as well in other lessons. And so secretion of chemical messengers that we call neurotransmitters. And so today we're going to be looking at the anatomy of a neuron, which allows it to be excitable, conduct electricity, and then finally secrete chemical messengers in order to relay its messages. So let's go ahead and talk about the different anatomical regions of a neuron. And we're going to start right here with these branches. These branches are what we call dendrites. And these dendrites will extend, as you can see, they are thick processes that extend from a central body. This central body is what we call the cell body or the soma. So dendrites, they are actually the primary site by which this neuron is going to receive information. So they're going to receive input from neighboring neurons, so from neighbors. And once they receive this information is then going to be sent towards the cell body or the soma. And so the cell body or the soma is really important because it includes things like the nucleus, or the nucleolus, the Golgi, and pretty much any of the other organelles that you've studied in your cell chapter. So let's say cytoplasm as the fluid suspending the organelles, but also cytoskeletal elements. We have, of course, ribosomes, endoplasmic reticulum. So all of the organelles suspended in the cytoplasm, this is what you would find in the cell body. And so this is where a lot of the organelles and cell machinery are located. But then this input coming in from the dendrites needs to be integrated and processed. And so here comes the next region that is going to be a triangular region at the junction between the cell body and a very long process that we will talk about shortly. So this region right here is what we call the axon hillock. And this is the area in which the electrical impulse is going to be generated. So this region is very important because it's going to process or sum up all of the input received via dendrites, and then it's going to generate the electrical impulse. Okay? And this is known as your action potential. So after the action potential is generated, it is then going to propagate down a very long process. And this process is called the axon. And so the function of the axon is to propagate the action potential abbreviated AP, until it reaches the very end. And so at the very, very end of an axon, we have what we call axon terminals. And these axon terminals are really important because this is how a neuron is going to communicate with its neighbors, right? And so, as we mentioned before, one of the functions of a neuron is secretion. So this is where our chemical messengers that we identified as neurotransmitters are going to be released. And this is the way by which this neuron is going to convey its message to its neighbor, be it a neuron, a gland, a muscle. And so this is also where it's going to contact or form connections. So it doesn't really contact physically, but it will form connections. So, and these connections we call synapses. So it synapses with neighbors. And so these neighbors can be neurons, can also be muscle cells, because neurons can relay information and commands to muscles, or to glands. So the axon terminals are the site at which a neuron will connect with other cells and release its neurotransmitter. The last structure that we will talk about are these yellow components surrounding the axon, as you can see. This is what we call myelin sheath. And myelin sheath is really important for the axon. It is actually made up of what we call Schwann cells. And these are one type of support cells in the nervous system that are known as neuroglia, if this were in the peripheral nervous system. And we'll talk about the differences between peripheral and central neurons in class. But so this myelin sheath is formed by support cells. So they have nuclei, and they're going to wrap around the axon. But what is the purpose? Why should a neuroglia wrap around an axon? Well, it actually provides it with protection. So it protects it and it insulates it. Because this myelin sheath is made up of fatty tissue, adipose tissue. Not only does it protect it and insulate it, but it also allows the action potential to move down the axon at a much faster rate. So it actually speeds up action potential propagation down the axon. Okay, and so the reason why your action potential is going to travel faster when there is a myelin sheath is because we have gaps in between myelin sheath, and these gaps are what we call nodes of Ranvier. So these are just gaps in between the myelin sheath segments, and they are going to allow the action potential to jump. This electrical impulse will jump from one node of Ranvier to another. And this is what we call saltatory conduction. So nodes of Ranvier allow saltatory conduction, or the jumping of the action potential from one node to the other, and this makes the action potential travel much faster. So we call this saltatory conduction. Right? So this is pretty much all we need to know for now. in terms of the anatomy of a neuron.